about, or then we're going to actually talk about it, and then I'm going to tell you what we talked about. Indeed, Dean-Drummond says that the studies of both science and religion need to come of age. Neither can capitulate to the other one. This is one of her criticisms of the way that these two powerful forces in humanity have interacted in the past. The premise of her title is simple. There's much more to be said about evolution and Christianity than that they're either at war or they're friendly with each other by default. Such debates that picture them as either one of the two tend to push the background, or they tend to push to the background the central tenet of Christian theology, according to her, which is Christology. The philosophical traditions that D.D. calls upon for her task herein are wonder and wisdom. She argues against traditional views of Christianity because they seem to focus upon only the divine or human essence of Christ. And she also has a major griping, I guess you could say, with the literal views about Adam and Eve, rightly so in my opinion. She therefore seeks to widen the proverbial agenda for Christology from being almost solely focused upon the incarnation to the almost exclusion of atonement and eschatology. You can read parenthetically what I have to say there. She also weaves into her discussion the Spirit of God, insomuch as the doctrine of Christology is more distinctly Trinitarian from the very outset. Again, I say, hear, hear. Throughout, but especially in the first chapter, D.D. is highly critical of the three conversation partners, Teilhard de Chardin, Karl Rahner, and Jürgen Moltmann. She somewhat accuses each of these three to be wedded, essentially, to a particular worldview of evolutionary biology. And the danger therein being that if the worldview changes, those weddings of those theologians to that certain worldview would collapse. That's her idea there. The first chapter, for example, asserts that Teilhard was correct in making evolution a central part of his theological agenda. And while many of his concepts and notions are out of date, she nevertheless acknowledges his forerunner status, so to speak. That's my terminology, not hers. Instead of either of these three gentlemen's ideas, that is Teilhard, Rahner, or Moltmann, Dean-Drummond puts forth the manner of relating evolutionary theory with Christology as a theodrama, quote unquote. That is her terms. Notably, the remainder of this book, which is not under discussion today, by the way, unfolds and extends what she writes largely about in the first chapter. In fact, Dean-Drummond argues that theodrama is an exercise in constructive theology that develops Christology in such a way to take account, due account, quote, of evolutionary biology without succumbing to either identification with it or alienation from it. That's the key point in this text. She neither wants to discount evolutionary biology or identify with it strictly. That is, with Christology anyway. She offers a way to think creatively and critically about Christ and evolution without a fusion of the two disciplines into one another. Indeed, she states that there should remain an appropriate distance, quote unquote, between Christology and evolution, recognizing that they each have their own proper areas of discourse. Having said all this, let's get into the meat of the text. And again, as I said, in this section, I'm going to actually tell you what we're talking about. In her introduction, Double D helpfully discusses both main subjects of my dissertation, Gould and Conway Morris. Although they differ, that is, Gould and Conway Morris, those two can be welded together, I contend, and I will attempt to do such in my dissertating document. I've actually already published a little bit on this numerous times, actually, but that's beside the point. Check me out online if you want to see some of the background behind this idea. D.D. gives a rather good interpretation of Gould, in my opinion, though she ultimately only advocates for a weak version of his theses, which does not accept a version of sympatric speciation, but only allopatric speciation instead, which I parenthetically defined that sympatric being speciation within the same geographical area, and allopatric being speciation over different geographical areas. In fact, in the first chapter, Double D also argues that the Christ event needs to be stronger, has to be thought of in kenotic terms. Although I differ with her meaning on the term of kenosis, she is still a friend of my view. That's my terminology. So I heartily welcome her pontificating upon kenosis. Nevertheless, she notes that her usage of the term theodrama is a metaphysical way to highlight those aspects of evolution that are often pushed to the side by readings that seek to develop a grand narrative of evolution or an epic, something that I use myself. And I'll tell you here quickly, I missed the significance of her statements against the idea of an epic and against the narrative. I read it and I understood what she said, but I just missed her point. She notes that it's hardly surprising that those involved in the evolution and theology debate are more drawn toward liberal accounts of Christology, wherein Christ is portrayed as a unique man only in so much as he uniquely fulfilled God's will in and through his obedient life. I take homage with that idea. With her in this, I heartily agree. Jesus, in my view, note not hers, was adopted into the deity precisely for the reason of his perfect obedience to God's will. But as I stated here, that's another debate for another time. Check out my recently published book entitled Evolution, Secular or Sacred, published by Whiff and Stock 2020, for my argument here. Nonetheless, Jesus in Double D's depiction is an archetype or a chief exemplification of what it is for a human to be united in self-offering to God. Importantly, both hers and my Christology is bottom up because Jesus becomes God rather than being God from birth. Ian Barber is similarly disposed, famous theologian of science, thinking that Jesus has bestowed deity pneumatologically, that is, through the Spirit. That is, it's a spirit Christology, which I heartily agree with, by the way. Jesus therefore presents us with a new stage in evolution and a new stage in God's activity. Using process thought, Ian Barber also suggests that the difference between humans and other animals is similar to the difference between Christ and other humans. Important point. That is, the difference is of degree, not of kind. That's a critical point. The difference between Christ and other humans is of degree, not of kind, just like humans and other animals is of degree and not of kind. Teilhard, meanwhile, as a Roman Catholic scientist priest, thinks that Christ fulfilled the yearning of science and the expectation of the natural world. Teilhard's approach is questionable, however, for several reasons, which Double D also points out. He understands that evolution is inherently progressive, which Double D criticizes. Further, his anthropocentrism is not amenable to modern biology. Thirdly, he is perhaps overly Christocentric, whereby Christ becomes remote from any understanding of the historical Jesus, if you understand that delineation there. And fourthly, he neutralizes evil through treating it as a part of the overall process. I've parenthetically noted the page references for you to look at in that first chapter. Ronner, our third partner, or our second partner, I should say, however, believes in Christology of ascent, rightly in my opinion. That is, Jesus of Nazareth was the first human of possibly many, I'll leave that open, to receive fully the grace needed to save the world. Transitioning to Moltmann, I must state that he's a mixed bag for me. Unlike us process theologians, he retains the classical notion of creatio ex nihilo, which notably our professor of record, Dr. Philip Clayton, does also. I'm working on him with that. I'm teasing Dr. Clayton. In Christ's self-humiliation for Moltmann, God withdraws from the Christ and allows the Christ to be pilloried and pummeled with abuse and pain. Indeed, for Moltmann, it is not through supernatural interventions, I should say, that God guides creation toward its goals and drives forward evolution, but rather through God's passion, various possibilities open up out of his suffering. The transforming power of suffering, which is an awesome phrase, the transforming power of suffering for Moltmann is the basis for liberation and the consummating acts of God, a view with which I heartily agree. For Double D, theology should draw on the idea of drama, and such a reading gives eschatology high import. And theodramatics is a way of talking about eschatology and history together in relationship with one another. Drama itself for Double D is about human actions and particular events in particular contexts, whereas theodrama is that which is connected to God's purpose. For Dean-Drummond, a theodramatic approach is always and forever an eschatological one. You can note parenthetically there my praise for her emphasis on eschatology. She goes on to note that the evolution of life is an integral component of the theodrama between God and his creatures. That's distinctly eschatological in orientation. A theodrama focuses in part on the punctuated phases, yes, cross-reference Gould, the love of my life, of evolution, wherein improbable events draw together in a way that only one lineage survives the epic of evolution and not others. A theodramatic approach recognizes that most species have been wiped out in history with no survivor left to give progeny. In fact, on the measure of about 97 or 98% of all species that have ever existed have left no survivor today. And that means that nature is tragic and evolutionary dramatics are always brought to the fore. This theodramatic approach of Double D brings the tragicness of nature into a juxtaposition with an understanding that God works in and through the tragicness of events. This theodrama, therefore, does not seek a generalization of evil, nor does it attempt to wash away the contingency of events. Double D finds herself here in good company, I might say, with Gould and myself, jokingly. Interpreting the action of God in human and evolutionary history, including Christ's own history, in dramatic terms, lends itself to the development of a canonic Christology, to which I heartily agree, though not with the way that she's using the term canonic per se. In my thinking, check out McCall 2007 and 2011 and 2011 and 2017 also. In my thinking, a canonic Christology has the advantage of affirming the full humanity of Jesus while also affirming the assumed divinity of Christ Jesus. Indeed, Double D characterizes kenosis as a self-emptying, whereas I characterize it as the pouring out of divinity instead. Double D asserts that the dramatic encounter of Christ and the natural world are best understood in the context of theological beauty of the world, or as she puts it, with natural wonder. In so stipulating this, Dean-Drummond affirms that the first scene in the theodrama is one that begins by being grounded in the natural world and not with human beings or even with the presence of the Christ child. The first scene of the theodrama is one that is grounded in the natural world. In presenting the challenge of relating Christology and evolution, Double D insists that it must retain hope for the future, but also probe our own identity as evolved humans living in an evolved world today. So what does all this mean? In this section, I will tell you again what I've already told you, but in a different manner. Double D everywhere notes that theologians who have considered the relationship between Christ and culture have, in various ways, largely failed to take into account the significance of the evolutionary way of looking at the world, with the notable exceptions being Teilhard, Rahner, and Moltmann, though she still criticizes them, as we aforementioned. As her corrective, I should say, Double D tends to picture evolutionary history as a theodrama rather than as an epic narrative, as the aforementioned scholars, Rahner, Teilhard, and Moltmann, and myself included, do, although I'm not a scholar, I'm just a peon, but regardless. As she notes, much of the remainder of the book seeks to do just that. That is, work out what it means for evolution and Christology to be seen as a theodrama, wherein wonder and wisdom become the linkage between the director, that is God, the stage player, that is Christ, and the experience of the proverbial audience, that is us. For Double D, even non-human creatures are not simply the stage for human activity, but are included in the theodrama as such. She, I assert, is a much needed corrective for the excesses of the past. Thank you for your time.
Well done, Bradford. That was a lot of work to give us an overview of the beginning, and I appreciate it. You'll email that to me, and I'll put it up on the website so that others can see what you've done. Really a rich lot of material. What we need to do as a class is to pull back, well, first to see if there are any questions, and then to pull back and see if we get the big picture of the task that that Celia is taking on here at the end of the semester. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone unmutes and wants to ask a question or make a comment directly to Bradford. And then we'll step back from the details, take a 10,000-foot view, like Benjamin's airplane, and see where this whole thing is pointing. Comments or questions from any of the other 10 of you?